thank you for joining us for today's program, Gala Porras-Kim, Containment and Framing. Thanks to the team at the Fowler that works to make these events happen. We're dealing with a lot of different time zones today, so that takes a lot of coordination. And so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. My name is Matthew Robb, and I'm the Mesoamerican Specialist at the Library of Congress here in Washington, D.C. But for 7 years, I had a chance to be the Chief Curator at the Fowler Museum, and it's good to be back, albeit virtually. Before I introduce today's panelists, I'd like to note that the views and opinions I share in this program are my own and do not necessarily reflect those of the Library of Congress. This program is designed to be a conversation between myself and Kavior Moon, an art historian and critic based in Los Angeles, and Gala Porras-Kim, an artist who lives and works in Los Angeles and London. So I will introduce Gala first. Gala lives, as I mentioned, and works in Los Angeles and London. She received her MFA from CalArts in 2009 and a master's degree in Latin American Studies from UCLA in 2012. She's had solo exhibitions at different cities around the world, most recently the Museo Universitario de Arte Contemporáneo in Mexico City, the Centro Andaluz de Arte Contemporáneo in Seville, Gasworks in London, and at the Contemporary Art Museum of St. Louis, Missouri in 2022, different installations at Amant and Kadist in Brooklyn, and MOCA in LA in 2019. She's participated in numerous biennials, including the 12th Liverpool Biennial earlier this year, the 13th Gwangju Biennial, and the 34th Biennial de Sao Paulo, the Whitney Biennial in 2017, and the Hammers made in LA in 2016, which we'll hear more about in today's program, perhaps. She's also received numerous awards, including an Art Matters Foundation grant, a Joan Mitchell Foundation Emerging Artist Grant, and a Creative Capital Grant, and has participated in residencies at the Getty Research Institute and the Delphina Foundation in London and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. Her work is in the collections of MoMA, the Whitney Museum of American Art and the Brooklyn Museum, MoCA here in LA, LACMA and the Hammer Museum, the MCA and DePaul Art Museum in Chicago, and the Dallas Museum of Art and the Perez Museum in Miami. Kavior Moon is an art historian and critic based in Los Angeles, where she received her PhD in art history from UCLA. Her scholarly work focuses on institutional critique and experimental post-studio art practices, which makes her the perfect person to talk about Gala's work. She's taught at UCLA, the Art Center College of Design, Claremont Graduate University, and the Southern California Institute of Architecture in Los Angeles. And her writings and reviews have appeared in many publications, including Art Forum, Art in America, Art News, Kaleidoscope, and Extra Contemporary Art Quarterly. Please join me in virtually welcoming Gala and Kavior to the screen.
Hi, Matthew. Hi, Gala.
Hi, Matthew.
Hi, y'all.
Matthew, thank you for those introductions. And before we get started, I just want to say a special thank you to Hannah Yu, who was the person at the Fowler to invite me to this conversation and did all the hard work of coordinating and organizing it. And I'm thrilled to be able to talk to Matthew and Gala about the exhibition now on view at the Fowler. If you haven't seen it already, you still have a couple of weeks. It closes on October 29th. So if you haven't seen it, go check it out. And if you have seen it, you might want to check it out again, because there's a lot to look at and to think about and to read. So for this talk, I'm going to be sharing some installation views of the exhibition. Matthew and Gala, at any point, if you want to share your own images, feel free to boot me off and then to take over and screen share whatever you want to include into the conversation. Yeah, so let's get started. I'm going to begin by showing a kind of an overall view of the exhibition. Okay, here we go. Okay, so this is basically what you see when you first walk in. And as you can see, the exhibition is organized roughly chronologically if you go counterclockwise. And so on the right, in the front right, you see Gala's work reconstructions, which she did for Made in LA in 2016. In the back, you see a few different projects related to Mesoamerican histories, collections, objects, and like methodological issues. And then in the front on the left, you see a recent work where Gala revisited a different part of the Fowler's collection. And I was thinking that our conversation together could roughly be chronological, but then obviously we can also just see how the conversation goes. And I also just wanted to start kind of like easy. And at the beginning, I love hearing backstories about how things come into existence. Gala, you did a public conversation for the Broken Rail a couple of months ago. And when I was listening to that, I realized like, wow, this exhibition is really a reflection of not only your engagement with the Fowler collections, but also your conversations, your friendship with Matthew. And that this exhibition was like 7 years in the making, which is, you know, like approximately how long it takes to get a PhD at a place like UCLA.
Yeah, I mean,
you know, it's a kind of a long time. So I want to start with like, how'd you two meet? What interested you in each other's work? And
yes.
how did that lead to this exhibition?
Well, thanks for having me here. I always love talking to Matthew and Kavior. But I think, you know, this is the only exhibition I've made where it feels like it wasn't the exhibition first. Like Matthew and I had been having conversations for so long that for each of the individual sort of bodies of works that I've been making for the past seven years, I guess now. And so the way that we met was actually that I was doing a public program conversation at the Hammer with filmmaker Jesse Lerner, and Matthew he's our connection friend, and we just met right after the talk. And you know, when I found out that he was a Mesoamerican expert, I was like, oh my God, this is my people, you know, because I always since I was making works about, you know, Mesoamerican history at the time, it's always really great to find someone who's actually knows like what is happening within the field of history during that time, to actually just bounce off ideas and sort of fact check what is the temperature of things or today. And so I started asking him questions ever since then.
And you know, and the shout out to Jesse is a really crucial one, because you know he's been interested in, you know, in a lot of these histories around sort of like modern constructions of Mexican archaeology, and that's what the kind of documentary that they were showing that night that he and Gala talked about, ruins, is a really great example. Oh wow, where'd Kavior go?
But it was also because that installation itself was about the Fowler, the Fowler collection,
yeah, Fowler collection
itself, and you had just started working there.
Yeah.
And so I think it was just you had seen the exhibition, and then we had to like
check notes.
Yeah, because I was like, you just started working there. Like I just borrowed a bunch of your stuff. I hope that you're okay with.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was, you know, it was one of those things where it was sort of like, it was always sort of part of the potentiality of working at the Fowler, you know, back in because the Fowler had kind of developed this kind of reputation for you know, contemporary art programming, in addition to the kinds of more traditional programs and or more traditional art curatorial programs, and so for me it was a really special opportunity to be able to kind of start having conversations with contemporary artists like you, like Gala, and also to start investigating, you know, on the one hand, you know, it was at the beginning of a time of sort of thinking about a museum collection as a whole more critically and more carefully, and not just the sort of the Mesoamerican part of it, because I was, as chief curator, I was in charge of at least, you know, sort of thinking a little bit more carefully through all of the issues that a collection would face. So it was
Other
really a little bit
Kavior.
of that. It was a little bit of both, you know. It was sort of like I
Yeah.
knew a lot about Mesoamerica, and you knew a lot about Mesoamerica, and you were approaching, you know, we were approaching things from kind of like these sort of
I think Kavior just came back, but
yeah.
Yeah,
what
I'm
we
sorry.
what we were trying
were
to
just
say
kind
was
of
basically
extemporizing.
just like it's important for me at least to find someone who will like relax their like individual methodology and their like field of expertise to some degree to work through these questions of the field itself. And so that's how it was, just testing out the waters with Matthew. And, you know, I think that since then we've had conversations about each one of those bodies of works that just go into this like 4-hour sort of rabbit hole where random things will come out of there, no? And so it's just like, you just take a notepad with a singular like subject, and then that leads to like collections or like conservation or like anything. And so now that Matthew's at the library, it's gonna be so good.
Yeah, there are a lot of nooks and crannies, let's say that.
Yes. And so I can actually, if you want, I can share some of the details of the processes of like the back works that Matthew and I actually, he was directly, unless you want to talk about the front, I don't know which way.
No. Yeah, we can start with those. Are they in the exhibition or are they different works?
Oh, both. Is the like the original idea. So it's oh well, let me share the whole thing. Do I share the whole thing or should I share?
Oh, you
share
did.
some of it. So you don't see my crazy desktop. So this is actually, if you see in the installation back there is the actual the work that actually Matthew was the one who showed me this stone, La Mojarra Stella, because I think ever since we met, he's been sort of looking out for different weird things that are happening in the field. And so I was interested in like, you know, undeciphered languages and how they were being represented today. And he's like, have you seen this rock? And so I looked it up, and then you were showing me, I think, like different articles in like Nature or something about how there has been this science, that was this dialogue of how some people had thought that they had deciphered it and the sort of text around that. And so I made this work that was 3 different ways of understanding the text. But of course it was like source info, no? And so I think that that was the first actual work. And then in the back, there's also this proposal for the reconstructing of ritual elements of Sun Pyramid on Teotihuacan, which is actually literally the work that Matthew curated into his show, City of Water, City of Fire.
Got it.
At the LACMA, which was New Finds of Teotihuacan. And so when I actually went to see his show, it was the first time I saw these stones that they had found at the top of the Pyramid of the Sun there. And, you know, through like in our actual like walkthrough, you know, it was just like, Matthew, what do you think about what happened to the pyramid when they took the battery out, if it was supposed to do a function back in the day, no?
Right. No, and I mean,
and that was it.
I mean, you know, because it's sort of like, you know, as a curator, you know, I mean, like especially a project like that, which required a lot of, you know, international collaboration, working very closely with archaeology teams at Teotihuacan, working very closely with any number of colleagues at the National Institute of Anthropology and History in Mexico to secure these loans, to secure their transportation, to work with everybody at the De Young, where the show was originally. Where I was working before I was at the Fowler, to everyone at LACMA, and you know, and there was a good amount of synergy between those 3 institutions already because of prior exhibitions that have been done. So it was a great team to work with in all of those instances. And so I was sort of like, yeah, isn't this great? And Gala's like, you broke the building.
You could, I could.
Anyway, yeah, I feel like there's a lot to unpack in this project, the proposal for the reconstitution of ritual elements of the Sun Pyramid at Teotihuacan. But wait, can we just back up and take a little bit, take a slightly closer look at Gala, if you can go back 1 slide.
Yeah, because I have a couple of, you know, fact
related to the La Mojarra Stella. So there's an an object all the way onto the right where these colorful shapes suspended in oil. It's kinetic, so it moves around. And that work is in your exhibition now at the Fowler.
Yes.
Can you talk about that work and like the issue about decoding, interpreting ancient Mexican American language, the issues that it brings up?
Yes, so I wanted to show these three because at the Fowler there are different versions of a similar idea with different samples of deciphered text. And so I was thinking the furthest one on the right, this disc has the text. It's almost in relationship to the panel in the behind it, where it has the actual text of the stone rendered in glass beads, so it's very actually hard to see when you walk in front of it. Depending on how you look at it, you can see it or not. The picture here is very specifically lit, but I thought that the object in the front would be the lighting element that would be like this sort of automatic writing, where the characters of the stone are just floating around and making new connections of the text, and the one in the back would be the set solid. And so in their relationship, you could see like, a set sentence structure, and then together with this randomized version that would just make like this incidental conjugations or something.
Right. Right, that it would create a legible text if
Correct.
you knew how to read it.
It is making a different type of legible text.
Certainly. No, I mean, it's sort of like, that's where I have to oscillate a little bit between
You're like, look at all the blue ones together.
Yeah. No, I mean, and I think I think, Kavior, I just I want to do a little, a little real-time fact checking. As I recall, Gala already had this idea about La Mohara, and she was doing a little bit of her own research, saying like, what do you think about this? I mean, so she was already, as I recall, she was already.
I thought you gave me that book. You gave me that beautiful book with the fold out. You're like, go look at that.
You were already on it. I might have done that, but I was like, I have a pretty distinct recollection that it was like, what about La Mohara steel? And I was like, oh, that's great. And the other thing that I think is really important to point out, just as a visual detail, that I certainly didn't notice, because this was an installation that Gala did for the Whitney Biennial, and what you see here is that you notice how low the bottom edges of the painting frames, or not painting frames, sorry, of the frames are to the floor. Like that is not a detail that I noticed,
until you installed it with me.
Exactly. And I think that but it's something that's really important, I think, to Gala's work. And and now that you have seen it, to those of you who are watching who might go see the show, you'll see it in the Fowler installation as well. And I think it's a good thing for Gala to sort of reference in a way.
Yeah, just to give it context in terms of the exhibition, this is the conjugations work is part of a section that is called Mesoamerican writing. And I thought it was also interesting curatorially. I don't know if this was a joint decision, or Matthew, if you were kind of pushing for this, but there's actually a little folder full of scholarly articles that actually gets into the nitty-gritty of the problems that Gala is elucidating, but also playing with. I mean, it's very playful in a way, in the works in that section.
I mean, I would say it was a little of both. I mean, it speaks in a way to sort of like Gala's interested with these kinds of scholarly issues. She wants to know. And then it was also the kind of the challenge in a kind of an exhibition context. Like we both knew, kind of from the get-go, that we wanted this to be a pretty like a low information density install from the perspective of the labels. And
I like how this is low density, because I'm like, this one has so much text.
Yeah, but I mean, it's just like it's like I'm used to being sort of like the pyramid.
Yeah, I know.
The pyramid's this big, it has all this other stuff going on, and also the Fowler, it's a university museum. It's in an academic context. So I think historically the Fowler has definitely it's certainly been willing to, if not embrace, sort of like very discursive labels in a lot of ways. But even then, there are kind of limits to being sort of like, well, if I have to explain everything about Lamahara and the Isthmian writing system and all of this, like the label is going to be really long.
Yeah.
And it was this kind of shortcut in a way, but also, it's a way of signaling, I think, some of the behind the scenes work that museum curators are doing, in terms of kind of compressing and consolidating knowledge into sort of like, quote unquote, easily digestible, short bits of text. And I think that was, again, sort of like that through line for thinking about the sort of like, how much do you want to know? It's like, how deep does the rabbit hole go?
But I think we didn't even show how deep it actually goes. That's a very, very, very shortened version. And so to some degree, is when we were thinking about the exhibition, again, like Matthew said, UCLA being a university museum, I was, because I have shown a lot of documentation before with other exhibitions that are only art spaces, but I actually thought that they always sort of accompany these existing works that exist independent of all of these other texts. But I don't want to take away the chance for an audience who is not wanting to look just on the surface and wants to actually know part of the formation of this idea. To give them the chance to look at it, because I've done that myself with exhibitions. It's difficult to go in and get overwhelmed by like so much text and everything, but to some degree I would want to do it for one or two things. If the work itself is like, you're like, oh well, when was the last time you went to an exhibition? You're like, I have to Google all the stuff about it, and so to some afterwards, and so to some degree we're like, we just gave you like the work, and also like basically the Cliff Notes of other interesting things that you could go look at, because even with in the other works with there's a documentation room that supports this Chichen Itza project that I made. It was also a very, very edited version. So to some degree, it's that Chichen Itza room it's a bunch of letters between the director of the Peabody Museum and the man Edward Thompson, who dredged the cenote in 1900s. And so, the first time that I made that work, when I was actually making the work, it was like so many more letters, and so each curator has made a different cut of that content, depending on sort of how the work gets framed in that exhibition. And so I think that Matthew's cut is totally different than the one I originally made, the one that Ruth Esteves made at Amant. And then it's a new way of understanding this, the history,
Yeah.
Which probably 4 people might be able to see because they saw both shows and because they read all of the letters. But to me, I was like, this work is made for you, like there's a different like level of expectation for an audience to spend. When I think about the works, it's like you can either spend 2 minutes looking at something and then you get 2 minutes worth of things back. But if you spend a whole 4 days and read the whole thing, then you have like so much more about the work.
Yeah.
So this is we can talk a little bit about this project, Precipitation for an Arid Landscape, which you began in 2000. Well, I don't know. I feel like the first exhibition was in 2019, but I'm sure it's so research heavy that you started working on it significantly before that. I want to give like a very brief overview so that people can get a sense of like what we're seeing.
And so that project was I spent the 8 months before COVID cut it short, started when I was at the Radcliffe at Harvard, because I knew they had the objects that were dredged at the cenote at Chichen Itza. And so my interest originally when I went to do that project was around the law and what was the regulation that basically moved the material from the cenote into the collection, because I was thinking like, okay, well, the law is almost, very parallel to like conceptual art, where someone is making the boundary of, like the world in some degree. And so we do that as artists as well. And so I'm thinking like the law is doing that en masse. And so how did this material like go through the legal tube to get from one place to the other? And while I was looking for all of these legal works, that's when, you just read through all of the documentation that they might have, or under conversations with the staff at the Peabody, etc. But the work ended up being sort of about, a registration and conservation work more than the law. Again, as the project, as I was reading the letters, there was so much, I guess, compelling text about the conservation of these objects that as soon as they started getting dredged from the cenote and getting into contact with air, they start falling apart. And so they had been conserved because they had been submerged underwater. And the cenote itself was the ritual donation pit to the Mayan rain god Chak. And so I was thinking about like, okay, so what does it mean when an institution is actually, anti-conservationing it or something, or putting something at risk that had been preserved because it had been in its original location, no? And so the text was about the general arch of the text of the project is this, the conflict between the driest spot in the storage of a museum and where the objects are actually being held together by conservation glue in the shape of an object that was not there anymore. Because what happened was that since many of the objects start falling apart, in the letters, there's information about how a conservator is, inserting glue into these particles to keep it together in the shape of a thing that is not that anymore. And so I thought that was the root of the thing. And of course, as many other projects I start by making this sort of index drawing just to sort of understand how the catalog looks like, because I don't understand the like straight up list type. And so I think that through the drawings, I actually have a picture of the whole thing if you want to see, because I think we were only able to show
one. Yeah.
One. And so we have, I made 7 of them, which is these, it's basically just what the Peabody has in their collection. Just like, the question was like, some registrar got a box full of random little things and somehow they had to make an order from it. And over time, exactly. And so you can see sort of like, by drawing the catalog, you can understand so many things about registration process or conservation of it, or like how did they get photographed. And then you have this like, which one is it? This like moche ceramic that inserted itself somehow into the Chichen Itza collection, you know what I mean? And so it's just getting into the little details of the catalog that, of course, I would never be able to have patience enough to go look through in day-to-day life. But through these I can. So
wait, is that because the moche is in South America?
Yeah, it's a Peru. So this one and this one, which obviously to me look so different. When you see it, it's like, why is that here? That's Peruvian. And what happened was that it got photographed next to object from the cenote as like, these 3 are like supermodel or whatever of the collection. And so then the image itself is in that Chichen Itza pile, no?
Right.
And so again, and through the viewing, it's not that I don't actually think about these actually being the ends to, the result of something or so, because even while we're looking at it, Mary Miller, who's Matthew's like, I mean, she's amazing. She's like Matthew. Came to the show. She's the Mesoamerican person, and she was telling me like, these gold discs, when they were originally made, they were actually crumpled up. They had this beautiful etching. Someone crumpled it up, donated it into the cenote, and when it came out, someone flattened it out so we could actually see the etching on it, but they never existed as a flattened disc. Now they're a new object in a new viewing because of the conservation of it. No?
And there's no documentation of that state of the object.
Yeah,
Like,
because they're
you know,
flat.
crumpled up tinfoil flat. I should just again a little more real-time fact checking. Mary Miller is in fact director of the graduate or the Getty Research Institute.
Yes.
Was my advisor as a graduate student when she was a professor of art history for many years at Yale University. So
wait, and so Matthew, as you can see there, this project is massive and there's a lot of elements that were not included in the Fowler. So, and then I also noticed that Gala mentioned that you and she re-edited what was included in the documentation room. And I also noticed in the wall labels that you rewrote some of the wall labels. What was the editorial process? Like, what did you really want to highlight in how you were presenting or representing this project?
well, I mean, look, you know, it's sort of like in a dream world, we would have shown everything. I would have wanted to show everything because in addition to the color drawings, Gala also did black and white of the textile fragments and some other objects.
Right.
And the important thing to point out, I would say, you know, sort of like, again, as a kind of like an end user, as a researcher who had to sort of, you know, Chichen Itza is just an enormously complicated site within Mesoamerica. It has its own complex history in terms of like relationships between the Maya world and central Mexico, and even just for archaeologists and art historians to understand basic aspects of its chronology has been quite challenging for decades. And this cenote material is kind of like the black hole that a lot of this revolves around because of the sort of ways in which it was taken out of the ways in which Thompson took it out of the cenote and how much material ended up at Harvard. There's material that went from the Peabody at Harvard back to Mexico. There's other material that's in Mexico. There's other material scattered in other little bits here and there in different institutions in the US, Field Museum. We just found some stuff at, or I mean, I say found, but I mean, just realized that there's some stuff at the National Museum of the American Indian as well. And so the thing that I want to emphasize in saying that all that is that Gala's drawings are the best, most comprehensive, visual register of the material that any of us have access to. The material has never all been published in one place. And so I would have loved to have gotten more of the work, but this is the sort of like the weird inversion of the issue is that now all of those works are now scattered as well. That they're all in different institutional contexts, in different private and public collections. And so I will tip my hat to the curator of the future who's able to track them all down and reunite them. Because it would be almost as challenging as getting objects from the Peabody back to Mexico, I would say. And it's important to point out as well, I mean, Gala talked about this, the legal issues as part of this. It is a Mexican Supreme Court case in 1934 that decided that the Peabody had legal title, or that Thompson's heirs had title. It's very complicated. But that essentially the Mexican Supreme Court decided that it was okay for these objects to be in the Peabody's possession.
Because it was dredged from a naturally occurring site, not a man-made thing. So I think, through reading these documents, I have learned so much about, that was the sort of the legal case I wanted to make. That was like, it's so much about sculpture. And so it's like, if it is a material coming from a sculpture, then legally it becomes an object that you can actually have. And if it's material in nature, then it's stuck being, then it's actually not heritage or something like that. And so,
I mean, yeah.
When you think about the tunnels, you're like, well, that's totally that's contemporary like regulation trying to like define what this material might have been based on like shapes, whether it was like man-made or not.
Right. So for that editing process, Kavior, that you asked about in terms of like the kind of the archival cut, the one that Gala and Ruth originally developed, when the installation was sort of like, or when this project was presented in its, I think, most complete form, had a lot more of the kind of, you know, sort of history
Character
of Yucatan.
development.
Yeah, and
Who's
more sort of
who?
who's who, more of a who's who kind of situation. And I wanted, you know, in sort of thinking about it, it was just kind of like for me as a Mesoamerican specialist, it was too much, you know, that it was kind of like, well, then I got to then it's sort of like, well, then I've got to bring in like the lintel, you know, from the Temple of the Initial Series, which is like the first historical text of Chichen Itza. And then I got to go into like all of the other, you know, the history of the site itself. And I was just like, that is just, I mean, you know, you know, and then go through the 16th century and then the 17th century, you know, it was just going to get to be too much. And I decided that the sort of the rationale that I could work with was because, you know, there are these components to these projects for Gala where she's writing to the institution, that there's so much of that kind of, you know, epistolary content, as it were, and that these letters that the Peabody, you know, that Gala and Ruth went through the first time, and that the Peabody, you know, gave permission for reproduction, you know, they show that kind of institutional backstory, which is another part of the work in a way that Gala does more broadly. And so there, and you know, she and I had lots of conversations about the project that she did for MOCA in LA, and the ways in which that kind of engagement with the different people in the institution is also part of the work from Gala's perspective in some ways, and that you were seeing a little bit of that in the presentations of these letters. And I also thought that this edit, as it were, of these letters was an opportunity to sort of focus a little bit more on the back and forth that the institution has within its own files, within its own sense of these objects, because I think it's important both for all of us who work in these kinds of contexts to understand, you know, how things change over time. But I also think it's important for visitors, the ones, as Gala said, who really who might take the time to sort of go through it, to realize that you know, these institutions are made up of people, and people have to decide to do things or decide to not do things. They have to decide to record information or not. And that every one of those steps, and this again sort of is riffing on some of the things that I've picked up from Gala, every one of those steps is a step in the life of those of the objects that are the subject of that. And it's really, it's possible to see, even within the kind of waxing and waning of the correspondence that the Peabody has, different ways that different participants, you know, understood the institution's role, you know, as a steward, as an obstacle to some of these things going back to Mexico, as somebody who wanted things to go back to Mexico, but understood that there were these other institutional layers, you know, which is to say, like the people who actually run Harvard are going to have to chime in on this. And so you get a sense of that kind of, you know, memos and writing back and forth. And of course, you know, there's this one really interesting character, Alfred Tozer, who is with these objects from when they're taken out of the cenote practically to when some of them start going back to Mexico.
I think he started off as a grad student who was working with the Peabody.
Yeah,
and then just had this decades-long relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, you know, and so there's this kind of thing. We didn't include any material from his diaries, but there's this kind of thing at the very end, sort of in the 50s, when some of the material is slated to go back to Mexico. He's just kind of like, I read through it and I just get this kind of like, I've had it with this stuff. I've done my piece. And so I think it's worth sort of like kind of revealing a little bit more of the kind of the raw material, archivally speaking, that has such an influence on what not necessarily the Peabody specifically, but what any institution does,
right,
with the objects that it's taking care of.
And I also think that it was for this exhibition, because the subject was, you know, how does the layers of its, you know, contemporary documentation or display or conservation actually change some of the material itself from the original into a new, like, kind of that's what we were talking with Matthew, like each one of those interventions was like a different patina, like a additional patina that over time, actually, you might not be able to see in the micro level these like decisions that people are making institutionally, but over a span of 100 years, you can really tell like the personality of like the institution, or, you know, sign of the times, or how was material like viewed from this specific location at this specific time. So to some degree, all of the works in the exhibitions were vehicles to understand those like conservation decisions or registration decisions, or even display that actually have that now are actually more, how would I even say that you can't even really see the original anymore. And so all of the ways that if you can I guess read the label in it about a historical past, you're like, but what is the thing actually physically in front of me? Like, how is this existing in contemporary life? Because this is actually an object that is here with us today that has gone through a lot of stuff, and now we're only referencing singular instance of its like function back in the day. No, and I guess this picture is one of the new works that Matthew and I guess we have been actually talking about this work for a long time.
Pretty quickly.
And
no, I just wanted to make sure that we address this section before we turn it open to a Q&A.
yeah.
Yeah, so when did you start? So these are objects that I'm guessing, Gala, you and Matthew collectively selected from a specific collection within the Fowler's collection, that objects that came from the Henry S. Wellcome Trust. And so when did you start looking into these trust objects? Like, when did this project start? Like, so it's exhibited now, the date is 2023, but when did it actually start?
Actually, the idea was like started a long time ago. I think it has changed shapes throughout time, and the actual original idea has not happened. You know, it's basically thinking about the institution as you know, the oversight, the different storages in the museum as like contemporary burial ground for a lot of the material that doesn't get seen. You know, like I think that one of the things that now I understand from museums is that the different sites of the storage also reflect the inability of the institution to deaccession anything. So it's this like in-between way of dealing with a mass that it cannot be actually contained within the museum. And so as far away as it gets from the center into the oversight storages and further away, it's almost like an institutional type of burying, to be like, let it, nature can let it take it back because the policy doesn't allow for it. And so this project actually begun with a question about storage, because of some of the objects that are like from the first collection, the Wellcome, as you said, the Wellcome collection, which is the first collection that the Fowler was made with. But what we had sort of parallel but different approaches to this collection. I was interested in the wrappers around of it. So you can see in the front here on the left is this, I think it's arrows. Yeah, correct. Yeah. Arrows that were wrapped in this newspaper. And then it's in these bags because moving stuff from the offsite into the actual museum needs to go through this conservation process to get rid of the bugs or whatever.
Pests, mold,
or
whatever.
Anything. But what interests me was that now this newspaper has become old enough so it won't be unwrapped, because now is the newest antiquity in the collection. And so in a sense, it's like the storage itself becomes this, like, I was thinking of it like a wine or cheese thing, where it's like, as the longer it stays there, the like better antiquity it gets. So whatever you put in there is just stewing in ancientness or something. So if I start putting, like, I don't know, my cell phone in there, in like 100 years, it'll be like an ancient institutional cell phone or whatever.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
so
and
that's what it was.
you know, and again, you know, like a couple of clarifications. The Wellcome collection was not the first collection that the Fowler got, but it was certainly the one that transformed the Fowler in the into the institution that it is today.
Mhm.
And you know, and I think it's sort of like there's almost something a little obvious about, you know, Empire News, you know, June 7th, 1959. It's like, so the Wellcome Trust was the, you know, the collection that had been formed, what remained of the collection that had been formed by Henry Wellcome, who, you know, was a pharmaceutical magnate in the late 19th and early 20th century. Glaxco Wellcome, Wellcome Burroughs, those are the kind of corporate entities that it turned into. And a lot of the material that Wellcome bought or Wellcome had his team buy. And there's a great project that the Fowler staff is still doing, Erica Jones and Carly Forbes. Carly did a great show a year and a half or a couple of years ago now called Particular Histories. You can look up a lot more about the history of individual objects and kind of more about the Wellcome Trust. But you know, you get a sense of the scale of the collecting activity that they were engaged in, that when they gave material to the Fowler in the early 60s, they were giving material that had been like in the Wellcome Trust, you know, since at least 1959. And somebody had just wrapped it up in a bottle or, you know, a bunch of newspaper and put it in a box. And then that box eventually comes to LA. And so it is this kind of quandary, as Gala was describing, you know, that newspaper is old, it is fragile. It's the kind of stuff that just like it's pulp paper that just will crumble when you touch it. You know, and so you get into this kind of researcher quandary where it's like, well, I can go find a copy of that newspaper online, right? I mean, theoretically, that should be possible. But then this other kind of conservation challenge and registration challenge, it's just kind of like, what are you going to do with those objects?
It's an example of how things were wrapped in 59.
Yeah. And so it becomes its own kind of record of that moment in time. And this is also a little bit, I would say, what's going on with the objects from box 2 and box 5.
Yes.
So these are some views of box 2.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is my favorite box. That you know, it's this kind of thing where, again, like on the outside of the box it says fakes. And for me, you know, and I think a little bit for Gala, it's just like, well, fakes.
What's a fake?
What's that about?
It's a real fresh copy of something.
But again,
Really,
it's sort of like
it wasn't even a copy.
Right, it wasn't even a copy. It's kind of like these things, and it's a little challenging because of the way that that Gala, you know, wanted to emphasize, like, or at least you know, that kind of the process of sort of like unpacking a box and sort of the kind of liminal states that these objects are in a way. You know, it's like we know what auction they came from, you know, again, thanks to the work that the curatorial team at the Fowler's been doing. And we know that auction, you know, it's sort of like they're not sold as ancient, they're just sold as Mexican. And so it's sort of like, and so then they come to the Fowler and somebody decides that, oh, it's like, oh, these are kind of trying to be ancient Mexico, but they're fake. And so they get put in a box, they get wrapped up very carefully. But they get put in a box, and the box gets labeled very specifically with what's inside it. But we didn't have pictures of these objects because, again, there's that kind of patina that it's like, well, if it's a fake, you don't want to spend all that much time on it. But the thing about these objects is they do have this kind of temporal instability that they kind of, they're not necessarily pitched as fakes. Somebody may have bought them as authentically old, but again, you just, there's a lot you don't know about that kind of thing. I've never seen anything quite like these objects before in either an ancient or a kind of modern forgery context. So I think that they do kind of represent a different aspect of things. Yeah,
like you were saying that there were like maybe tchotchkes for tourism 100 years ago or 150 years ago that someone made in the style of Mexico. But then I could imagine someone in the museum just by putting that fake on that box and changing the entire category of this thing into a singular new version that sort of deletes any consideration of what this material might have been when it was made, which was,
and who it was made for,
exactly.
You know, what market was it made for? And I think that, you know, this is a really challenging moment, you know, when these objects, I think the auction is from 1928. And so presumably the objects were made sometime before then, I would probably say, because I will say I think they probably are from the 20th or the late 19th century, but then you've got to get into this thing where it's sort of like the field of Mexican archaeology at that point in time is a very sort of amorphous thing. Like we don't know what we know now. In terms of like when certain cultures were active, when certain buildings were built, who knew what when about other places and other times, the sort of an indigenous Mesoamerican sense of history that, we know that these places are interacting with each other now. But for then, I mean, just to sort of put that time thing back on it, it's sort of like nobody had any clue what time depth actually even was really. And so they represent a certain vision of time, of a place, a past.
And we were actually thinking of it like, we were talking about it in terms of stowaways, like somehow they made it into the ship as antiquities and then like are just sort of there, but not there, basically there. So
actually just listening to you converse about these objects and the process of finding them and visiting the different storage areas of the Fowler made me see this work in a different light. So it's called Fras Monochrome. And now I'm guessing that these like kind of anomalous quote unquote fakes or these objects from the Wellcome Trust were put into a storage unit that was maybe less climate controlled. And so there is my speculation correct that there will be like more frass, which are like insect dropping?
Yes. Because so the audience is different then. So I was actually thinking that the further it goes away with these like kind of stowaway parts, yes, it's not climate controlled. So the audience is a new audience that is not made for humans anymore, but the bugs and other natural things that are actually interacting with that material every day, And so the Fras Monochrome is essentially the collection that has been eaten by moths and then made into a new shape.
Right. Right. And it's sort of like this is sort of like in the broader context of some of Gala's work, like, there's a mold piece that you did with the British Museum. There's another kind of dust gathering piece that Gala
it's just
did
different deaccession ways. Like, how do things leave the museum? Not through deaccession policy, but through other ways. And so through frass body, through moth bodies is one of them.
Yeah, and I would say, these are real challenges for cultural institutions of any size, regardless of where they are. The challenge, the mandate to sort of to care for these things in perpetuity, and that's to go back to some of the legal language, forever is a long time. And I think what a lot of Gala's work calls attention to is, what do you mean when you say that? And these are questions that museums grapple with, behind the scenes on a daily basis. How much room do we need to take care of things?
I just wanted to mention to the audience that in the remaining minutes left, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them into the chat box so that we can talk about them. And then also maybe just to start to wrap things up. So I can see how both of you have common interests and that, as friends or people who are both researchers, you're kind of like on the same side and you can have a lot of productive conversations. But I'm also wondering about your experiences working as artist and curator. And so there's obviously a lot of collaboration, but would there are points of, I don't know, like resistance or like Matthew, you being like, no, you can't do that, Gala. Either because it's not possible or just, I don't know, just because it didn't seem like conducive to the situation and moving things forward, or I don't know, what was it like to work together in a professional setting in which you might have similar but also somewhat different interests?
Yeah. Yeah,
Well,
I mean,
I think the easy thing for me is that Matthew curates antiquities. And so it was a little bit different. And I think our personalities are well matched, that if I can feel that something is like, I know, it's not only Matthew, it's basically the institutions period. It's like, okay, I know that I can't just like flood the entire gallery without some pushback or whatever. So I'm not going to do that to begin with, even if that's my bestest wish. But, so I think it's Matthew and I have been flexible enough when there is a disagreement to try and suspend our own, like, this is the way I would want it, to find a sort of compromise way. Even getting water in the gallery, it was how to put rainwater onto this installation. And so it's just different things. I'm not set in a specific final shape to begin with. I think that to some degree it has to fit in both the idea and also the exhibition space.
Right. No, and I mean, I always would say, in my own kind of practice, I mean, the C in curator stands for compromise, that you've got to figure out ways to kind of navigate, everyone's extremely valid concerns about whatever the issue is.
Yes.
And it can be challenging. I mean, there were some hard conversations around this show for sure.
Yes.
And in all ways, and I would say, the other thing that I would point out on a just a brutally practical financial level, when we were talking about the show, we always wanted, because I had it's like I had seen the La Mahara installation at the Whitney, and most of it was still in New York, because the Whitney acquired at least one of the pieces, if not two, but certainly, sort of like once the pandemic started to clear and institutions started to do more, re-ramp up their exhibition programs and things like that, shipping costs were prohibitive.
Yeah.
And for a small institution, I mean, I think for an institution of any size, you have to start looking at the shipping costs, and start really wondering, it's sort of like, is that where we want to spend tens of thousands of dollars? Because that's what it takes.
Yeah.
For institutions to pull these things off. I think it started to shift back, more into the direction of the exhibition industrial complex, as it were. But I mean, it's sort of like that's another thing when you start to have hard conversations about sort of like, I don't know if this is where I want to spend the money, things like that.
So we have one question from the
Go ahead.
audience. Adam asks, Gala, what are you working on now? Maybe we can just end with this question. It's like, what do we have to look forward to, Gala? What's cooking?
I'm installing a show today that opens in Korea at the end of the month. There's two of them. One is the new work that I've been making for the past almost a year. That is, it's an exhibition of a single work with supporting works as well. And it's an index drawing of all of the national treasures of North and South Korea collated. And so the question is basically like, what is a national treasure when the nation is always moving around, and all of these objects basically predate all of the contemporary like divisions that happen? And so how does the catalog actually, how did it get made? How has it changed over time, etc.? So by collating them, you can actually see how they sort of start very even and sort of start falling, different categories start changing throughout the time, so that's what I'm doing next. And I'm actually working on an ongoing project that it's about the catalog, the TMS, not necessarily just the TMS, but just cataloging in general, and figuring out how to make with the LACMA Art and Tech a work that will be installed into the registrar computer, essentially, where it will add new categories of field information that are flexible. And so, for example, like rate of decay, or like when it's supposed to be deaccessioned, or things that would normally not be the standard taxonomy like labels, but more flexible. So all of these sort of different patinas that we're talking about can somehow be also accounted for in the institutional brain. No.
No, I mean, it's funny to like that's amazing, and it makes me just sort of think about like database structures in general, where we talk about like fields as containers, you know,
Yeah.
and then it's sort of like, is that container, is that field going to be able to support, you know, images of Post-its and plastic bags, perhaps? So
Yeah, I love how your work is like deeply material, and you're like looking how things get eaten or decay over time, but it's also super epistemological. It like asks like the biggest questions, like how does knowledge get made, basically, and by whom, you know? So anyways, well, thank you so much, Gala and Matthew.
Kavior,
And
thank you.
great. All right. Well, I think that's
Yeah, thank you, Kavior.
it.
Have a good time, everybody, wherever you are.
Bye.